the book of Romans, like all the New Testament letters, is meant to be read in a single setting. It was not meant to be broken up into pieces per se in order for us to understand it. Now, it's important for us to understand the component parts so that we understand the whole better. But you have to understand it in light of the whole, which is why it's important that we remember where we've been and where we're going.
Something's wrong with everything I ever wanted for myself. Something's wrong with everything I ever wanted for myself.
Now, the first section, or the first movement in the book of Romans is commonly understood to be the first 4 chapters. The entire book is about justification. In those first 4 chapters, we see our need for justification, and we also see the means by which we're justified. And so we see in chapter 1 that the Gentiles are in need of justification because they're sinful without the law. We see in chapter 2 the Jews need justification because they are sinful under the law. We see in chapter 3 that all men are sinful and in need of justification. And there in chapter 3 we see that God has made a way for that justification in the person and work of Jesus Christ there at the end of the chapter. In chapter 4 we see that this is applied to us by faith. Those are those first 4 chapters that condense our understanding of justification. We move then in chapters 5 through 8 to this application of justification. And specifically in chapters 5 through 8, we get a better picture of the outworking of justification, commonly known as sanctification. That's what's happening here in chapters 5 through 8. We have to grasp that and understand the federal headship of the first Adam and the federal headship of the last Adam in order to grasp what's being spoken of here in what is one of the most complicated chapters in the book of Romans, that is chapter 6. We understand in chapter 5 the federal headship of Adam in that because of the one man, sin entered the world and death through sin. So death passed to all of us, sin passed to all of us because our federal head, Adam, our representative, sinned. He was our federal head, he was our representative, and he sinned. If we live in a monarchy, our federal head is the king. And if our federal head, the king, declares war on another kingdom, that means we, because we are under our federal head, are also at war with this other kingdom.
Something's wrong with everything I ever wanted for myself. Something's wrong with everything I ever wanted for myself.
Adam, our federal head, fell and sinned, and in him we fell into sin. But in chapter 5, we see the good news, that we have a new federal head in the last Adam, who succeeded where the first Adam failed. The last Adam is the federal head of all of those who belong to him and who are therefore in him by faith. You get under the federal headship of the first Adam by birth. Amen. By birth. That's how you get under the headship of the first Adam, by birth. It is not some act that you commit later on in your life. You do not make a decision later on in your life that you will align yourself with the first Adam. You are born in sin and shaped in iniquity. It is your birth that aligns you with your federal head, Adam.
Something's wrong with everything I ever wanted for myself. Something's wrong with everything I ever wanted for myself.
It is also birth that aligns you with your federal head, Jesus. It is the new birth. It is being regenerate or being born again that unites you with your federal head, Jesus Christ. This is incredibly important to understand, because if we don't get this, we don't understand chapter 6. In chapter 6, verses 1 through 14, we see the picture of what justification does in granting the believer victory over sin. I almost hesitate to say the words because there's so many caveats that need to be offered. But justification grants to the believer victory over sin.
Something's wrong with everything I ever wanted for myself.
So eschatologically, we know that we will ultimately have victory over sin. But also, in a temporal sense, in the here and the now, we have victory over sin. And we understand what that means when we understand Romans chapter 6. This is crucial. But before we get there, let me help you for just a moment see why it is difficult for us. This goes to the heart of our understanding of the gospel. And as we've said before, we have a warped understanding of the gospel because of the culture in which we live. We do not understand what the gospel is. We do not understand what the gospel requires. We do not understand what the gospel produces. We don't speak gospel language. And because of that, when you get to the ideas presented in chapter 6 and our victory over sin, we don't understand sanctification because we don't understand justification. Now, what do I mean by that? Here's what I mean. When you ask a person, what is the gospel? Most people in our culture will immediately begin to give you the plan of salvation. Not the gospel. They give you the Romans road, they give you the plan of salvation, they give you something like that. Not a pronouncement of the redemptive work that God has accomplished in the person and work of Jesus Christ. That's the gospel. The gospel is an announcement of what Christ has accomplished. That is the gospel. That is the good news. Okay? It's Christ, his work, not you and your work. That's the message of the gospel. Now, if we don't understand that, we don't understand sanctification. How does a person come to be in right relationship with God? Ask the average person in our culture and you'll hear phrases like this. You'll hear phrases like, they make a decision for Christ. Or you'll hear phrases like, they invite Jesus into their heart. Or you'll hear phrases like, I have decided to follow Jesus. Or you'll hear phrases like, I gave my life to Christ. Do you notice the consistent theme running through all of this? Okay? It's Frank Sinatra's salvation. I did it my way.
Something's wrong with everything I ever wanted for myself.
It's what I did. I decided, I invited, I opened, I gave, I. That's the way we understand justification. Justification is achieved by me doing something in order to get in right relationship with God. That's the classic Arminian understanding. It's synergism. Synergy, two forces working together, as opposed to understanding that justification is something that is granted to us by God, by grace, apart from anything that you or I could ever do. That's how we're justified. God saves sinners. But that's not the way we talk about salvation. And the reason we don't talk about salvation that way is because we do not believe that we are saved that way. We are Pelagian to the core. Again, Pelagianism, the idea that in the fall there is part of us that is untainted enough for us to be able to reason our way back to God, for us to be able to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, for us to be able to decide for God. Not that we must be born again in order to even see the kingdom of heaven. Listen to this from Lorraine Bettner. I've quoted Lorraine Bettner's classic work, The Reformed Doctrine of Predestination, a number of times. I would hope that you would get this, that you would have this, that you would read this. But listen to Bettner. He's quoting here, but he says, the contrast between Calvinistic and Arminian basis for morality is clearly stated in the following section of McFettridge. The two great springs by which men are moved are on the one hand conviction and idea, and on the other emotion and sentiment. As these control, so the moral character will be shaped. Don't miss this. If we believe that you are justified or you are saved by you deciding, you committing, you giving, you opening, whatever the case may be, then what do we have to believe about how you're sanctified? You deciding, you committing, that has to be it. So if there is a sin problem in your life, how do you deal with sin on the larger scale, as in going from death to life? Well, I dealt with it by making a decision and devoting or dedicating my life to Christ. So if later on in my life I have another sin problem, what I need to do? Rededicate my life to Christ. You follow that? I did it the first time. It didn't take. So I need to do it again. I need to redouble my efforts. I need to dedicate myself again. This alters everything. This alters the way we evangelize. If I believe, for example, that man is saved by his own initiative and inclination, then how do I evangelize? I have to get to that place in that man where I can motivate him to make the right decision. How do you help someone who's fallen in sin? Well, from an Arminian perspective, let's take, for example, someone who is violent. If someone is violent, what do? Well, maybe you give that person a proper outlet. What would that look like? A punching bag or mixed martial arts class. You need to go somewhere where you can get that aggression out. Your problem is that you don't have the right outlet. So you get the right outlet, that'll take care of your violence problem. Does that sound familiar? How about this? A proper understanding. You're violent because you don't understand, and what you need to do is learn how to sympathize with your victims. If you knew how your violence affected other people, you wouldn't be violent. Perhaps you need a proper technique. Learn how to count to 10. Learn how to take the time out. Learn how to do whatever. Again, or finally, perhaps you need a proper environment. You need to avoid the triggers that make you violent. This all ought to sound very familiar. And I'm not talking about outside the church. I'm talking about inside the church. All these things have one thing in common. We believe that this is something other than a sin problem, or worse. We believe it is a sin problem, but the way you overcome sin is by technique, understanding, will, etc., etc.
Something's wrong with everything I ever wanted for myself. Something's wrong with everything I ever wanted.
If on the other hand, we believe that salvation is a monergistic work, synergistic, God and man working together to save man, monergistic, God saving man by himself without man's help. If we believe that salvation is monergistic, that also changes the way we evangelize. If God saves sinners and God uses the foolishness of preaching and the foolishness of the gospel, what's my goal? My goal is to be as clear with the gospel as I possibly can, because that's what God uses. Is my goal to somehow manipulate the man into making a decision? No, because I realize I cannot do that. Salvation is a work of God. So I proclaim the gospel knowing that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation, not my manipulation of man. It also affects the way you help people deal with sin. Because if you were justified by God and his work in the gospel, you are also going to be sanctified by God, his work in the gospel. So, from an Arminian perspective, if man gets saved by him, taking initiative with that part of him that's not affected by the fall, my job is to affect that part of him that's not affected by the fall. If man gets sanctified and gets better by him learning techniques or changing his environment and things like that, what do my sermons sound like? 5 ways to have a happy life, 10 ways to reduce stress, 4 ways to overcome depression. Techniques, skills. And some of those things may be good. By the way, the things that we talked about, it might not be bad to have a punching bag. Might not be bad to learn sympathy or empathy. Might not be bad at all to learn to avoid certain circumstances or surroundings. Those things are not inherently bad. But if I believe that they are the answer, I've missed the mark.